My name is Sarah. Before the rot set in, before the flies whispered my name and my own skin became a stranger, I defined myself by one simple, catastrophic truth: I loved my husband more than my own soul. People used to tell us we were codependent, throwing the word around at dinner parties like a mild insult over glasses of Cabernet. I always just smiled, tucking my arm tighter through David's. They didn't understand. David wasn't just my husband, he was my gravity. I had grown up in a fractured home, bouncing between foster families in the Rust Belt, never owning anything that couldn't fit in a duffel bag. David, with his easy smile and his solid, unwavering presence, was the first permanent thing I had ever known. He was my anchor in a world that had always tried to wash me away. We lived in a modest two-story craftsman in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb. It was the kind of American dream I had used to stare at through the windows of other people's cars. We had a patchy lawn I was trying to coax into greenness, a mortgage that kept us up some nights, and a future I painted in bright, unwavering colors in my mind. That Tuesday night in late October started like any other. It was raining, a relentless, cold downpour that stripped the last of the autumn leaves from the maples lining our street. The house felt cozy, insulated from the miserable world outside. I had a pot roast slow cooking in the kitchen, filling the air with the savory scent of thyme and onions, the smell of stability. I was sitting on the living room sofa, folding laundry and watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the rain-slicked window, waiting for the familiar rumble of David's Ford Explorer in the driveway. He was late. When the door finally burst open around 8 o'clock, the wind dragged a whirlwind of wet leaves and cold air into our sanctuary. "David? Honey, you're soaking wet, dinner is." The words died in my throat. David didn't just look wet, he looked wreckage. His usually neatly combed brown hair was plastered to his skull. His expensive raincoat, the one I'd bought him for his birthday, was torn at the shoulder. But it was his face that stopped my heart. It was pale, draining of all blood, his eyes wide and rimmed with frantic red, darting around our living room as if he expected monsters to leap from behind the armchair. He didn't say hello. He stumbled inside, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the framed wedding photos on the entry table. He collapsed against the wood, sliding down until he was sitting on the foyer mat, shaking violently. I dropped the towel I was folding and ran to him, kneeling on the wet floor. "David! My God, what happened? Were you in an accident? Are you hurt?" His hands shot out, gripping my shoulders with painful intensity. His fingers were freezing, his knuckles white. "Sarah. Oh God, Sarah. I've ruined it. I've ruined everything." His voice was a ragged husk, choked with terror. I had never seen my strong, capable husband reduced to this trembling child. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my own chest. "What are you talking about? Talk to me, David. We can fix it. Whatever it is, we're together." He shook his head violently, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "Not this. We can't fix this. They're going to kill me. And then they're going to come for you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The cozy smells of dinner, the warmth of the house, it all evaporated, replaced by a sickening dread. Who is going to kill you? It took 20 minutes to get the story out of him, and every word felt like a stone being added to a weight around my neck. He dragged me into the kitchen, away from the windows, insisting we keep the lights low. The story was a nightmare cliché that I couldn't believe was happening to us. It started, he sobbed, with an online gambling habit he'd hidden from me for 2 years. Small debts became big debts. He tried to win it back, digging the hole deeper, tapping into accounts I didn't monitor. When the banks cut him off, he turned to private lenders. "They aren't banks, Sarah," he whispered, hunched over the kitchen island, refusing to meet my eyes. "They're animals. They're connected to syndicates out of Philly and Atlantic City. Real bad people. Faceless people." I stood against the refrigerator, numbness spreading through my limbs. The man I knew, the accountant who color-coded his spreadsheets, was gone. In his place was a stranger who had gambled away our security. How much? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. He named a figure that made my knees buckle. It was more than the value of our house. More than we could earn in 20 years. I missed the final deadline yesterday, he cried, burying his face in his hands. Two guys made of muscle and bad intentions, they grabbed me in the parking garage at work today. They showed me pictures, Sarah. Pictures of you coming out of the grocery store this morning. Pictures of you gardening. I choked back a scream, instinctively wrapping my arms around myself. The violation was immediate and visceral. I felt watched. Exposed. They said if I don't square up by the end of the week, they're going to hurt you first. They're going to make me watch, and then they're going to burn this house down with us inside. They aren't bluffing, Sarah. I saw their eyes. I looked at my husband, pathetic and broken in our own kitchen. Part of me, a new, hard part, hated him in that moment. But the overwhelming majority of my being just wanted to save him. I couldn't imagine a world without David. If he died, the anchor was gone, and I would float away into the abyss again. We'll go to the police, I said, grasping at straws. We'll sell the house. We'll cash out the 401ks. We'll run. He grabbed my wrist across the island. His grip was desperate. No police. They own the local cops. And we can't run, they'll find us. And the money, they don't want the money anymore. It's past that. They want to send a message. They want collateral. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, stagnant. The silence that stretched between us was pregnant with a horrific realization I hadn't yet fully formed. What do you mean, collateral? I whispered. David finally looked at me. His eyes were swimming with tears, pleading for understanding, pleading for forgiveness for something he hadn't even asked yet. There's a man. The guy at the top. He sees things differently. He saw your picture, Sarah. The one in my wallet. Bile rose in my throat, tasting of acid and terror. The room began to spin slow, lazy circles. He made a proposition. David's voice dropped so low I almost couldn't hear him over the drumming rain. He calls it a service agreement. He has associates. Business partners. Men who come into town and need discretion. I backed away from him until my spine hit the wall. My mind was screaming in denial, refusing to process what he was saying. My David. My protector. If you help them, he stammered, the tears flowing freely now, a performance of utter devastation. Just for a little while. A few nights. They'll consider the interest paid. They'll call off the dogs. They'll let me live, Sarah. They'll let us live. He was asking me to prostitute myself to gangsters. He was asking me to take the single most sacred thing I had, my body, which I had shared only with him, and throw it to wolves to save his skin. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I almost vomited right there on the linoleum. I felt dirty just hearing the words. It was monstrous. It was impossible. Get out, I whispered. Sarah, please. Get out! I screamed, the sound tearing my own throat. He fell to his knees again, crawling toward me, grabbing the hem of my jeans. They're going to kill me tonight, Sarah. If I walk out that door, I am a dead man. Please. I love you. I'm so sorry. You are the only thing that can save me. You're my only hope. I looked down at him, sobbing at my feet. I remembered the day we got married. The promise. For better, for worse. In sickness and in health. Was this the worse? Was this the ultimate test of that vow? My mind fractured. Logic told me to run, to flee this toxic, destroyed man. But love, that deep, pathetic, all-consuming root that defined my entire existence, held me fast. If I said no, David died. It was that simple. His blood would be on my hands. I would be alone again. I closed my eyes, and a strange, cold calm settled over me. It was the calm of a martyr stepping toward the pyre. I convinced myself in that moment that this wasn't degradation, it was sacrifice. It was the highest form of love. I would take this stain onto my soul so that he could live. I would be his savior. I opened my eyes. The kitchen looked different now. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, sharper. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a waiting room for hell. I reached down and placed a trembling hand on David's wet hair. He looked up, hope warring with shame in his eyes. "Tell them yes," I said, my voice hollow, sounding like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Tell them I'll do it. To save us." David buried his face in my stomach, sobbing his gratitude, murmuring promises that he would make it up to me, that it would only be a few times, that we would get through this together. I didn't hear him. I was merely existing in the space where my life used to be. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering against the roof like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry. I didn't know it then, but I had just invited the darkness inside. The price of devotion had been set, and I had agreed to pay it in flesh. The first creditor arrived exactly 3 days after the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp, stagnant humidity that seemed to cling to the very wallpaper of our home. David had spent those 3 days in a feverish blur of activity, focusing his nervous energy on the small guest room at the end of the upstairs hallway, a room we had once talked about turning into a nursery. Now, it was a tomb for my dignity. He had moved the furniture, replaced the bright floral curtains with heavy, light-blocking velvet, and insisted on lighting specific, pungent candles that smelled of sage, sulfur, and something sickly sweet, like lilies left too long in a vase of stagnant water. "It's for the atmosphere, Sarah," he had whispered, refusing to meet my eyes as he adjusted a rug. "They require privacy. They require a certain environment. Just follow the instructions I gave you. Don't speak unless spoken to. Keep the lights low." I had nodded like a ghost, already feeling my spirit retreating into the back of my mind, finding a small, dark corner to hide in while my body performed the tasks required of it. But as I helped him clean, I found things David hadn't mentioned. Beneath the heavy oak bed frame, etched directly into the hardwood floor, was a series of geometric patterns, jagged, overlapping circles and lines that made my eyes ache if I stared at them too long. When I pulled back the rug to vacuum, I saw more of them, drawn in what looked like charcoal or dried dark ink. They weren't just random scrawls, they felt intentional, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that I felt in my teeth. When I asked David about them, he had snapped at me, his voice sharp with a panic that felt more like desperation than protection. He told me they were protection symbols provided by his lenders to ensure no one bothered us. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The first man didn't have a name, or if he did, David never spoke it. He arrived in a black sedan that made no sound on our gravel driveway. I watched from the darkened window of our bedroom as a tall, slender figure in a charcoal overcoat stepped out. He didn't move like a person, there was a fluid, predatory grace to his gait that felt fundamentally wrong, as if his joints didn't quite work the way a human's should. David met him at the door, his voice a series of hushed, frantic murmurs, and then I heard the heavy thud of the guest room door closing. That was my signal. I walked down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my feet like they were pleading with me to turn back. When I entered the room, the air was so thick with that cloying incense that I felt lightheaded. The man was standing by the window, his back to me. Even without seeing his face, a primal chill raced down my spine. The room felt smaller, the shadows in the corners stretching out toward the bed like reaching fingers. "Sit," he said. His voice wasn't a voice at all. It sounded like the rubbing of dry leaves together, a hollow, rasping sound that seemed to vibrate inside my own skull rather than coming from the air around us. I obeyed. I laid back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling where David had hung a series of strange, metallic chimes that didn't ring, but rather clicked rhythmically against each other. As the man approached, the temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't the chill of an air conditioner, it was the bone-deep cold of a cellar, a frost that seemed to emanate from his very skin. When he touched me, I didn't feel lust, and I didn't even feel the expected surge of revulsion. I felt an immediate, violent drain. It started in my fingertips and toes, a numb, tingling sensation that rapidly traveled inward. As the act began, it felt as though invisible needles were being driven into my joints, not to cause pain, but to act as taps. I could feel something being pulled out of me. It wasn't just my energy or my will, it was deeper. It felt like the very marrow in my bones was being siphoned away, drawn out by the proximity of this cold, hollow thing. My vision blurred, and the geometric sigils David had hidden under the bed seemed to glow with a faint, sickly violet light that pulsed in time with my failing heartbeat. And then, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the eaves of the old house, but the sound was too rhythmic, too structured. It was a cacophony of voices, dozens of them, layered over one another, speaking a language that sounded like cracking stone and hissing steam. They weren't in the room, they were at the very edge of my consciousness, scratching at the thin veil of my sanity. The skin is the veil is the debt is the blood. I tried to scream, but my throat felt as though it had been filled with cold ash. The man above me didn't look at me. His eyes were flat, like two polished stones of obsidian, reflecting nothing but the darkness of the room. He wasn't a man. I knew it then, with a certainty that shattered the last of my denial. This was something else, something ancient and hungry that David had invited into our home. When he finally left, nearly an hour later, I couldn't move. I lay on the bed, my limbs feeling as heavy as lead and as hollow as dry reeds. My skin felt tight, itchy, as if it were a suit that had suddenly shrunk 2 sizes too small. I looked at my hands in the dim light and saw that they looked gray, the vibrant pink of my nail beds replaced by a dull, lifeless slate color. David came in a few minutes later. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't hold me. He walked straight to the bedside table, picked up a small leather pouch the man had left behind, and weighed it in his hand. A look of intense, frantic relief washed over his face, a look that felt more obscene than anything that had just happened to me. He was pleased, Sarah, David whispered, his voice shaking. He said you have a very potent resonance. This covers the interest for the whole month. We're safe. For now. I wanted to tell him about the marrow. I wanted to tell him about the whispers and the violet light and the fact that I felt like I was dying from the inside out. But as he looked at me, I saw the hunger in his eyes, not for me, but for the safety that pouch represented. He looked at my gray skin and my trembling hands, and he didn't see his wife. He saw a ledger being balanced. Over the next 2 weeks, more of them came. Some were tall and thin like the first, others were bloated and pale, their skin looking like wet parchment stretched over rotting meat. Each one brought a different kind of cold, a different layer of whispers. The guest room became a place of perpetual twilight, where the sun never seemed to penetrate even at noon. The sigils on the floor began to bleed a dark, oily substance that stained the underside of the rug, and the smell of rot became a permanent resident in the hallway. David grew more distant yet more attentive to my physical state. He began bringing me tonics, thick, bitter syrups that tasted of iron and earth. He told me they were vitamins to keep my strength up, but after I drank them, the whispers grew louder, more coherent. I began to understand bits and pieces of the profane liturgy they chanted at the edge of my hearing. They were talking about a harvest. They were talking about the shedding of the veil. By the end of the 2nd week, I could no longer walk up the stairs without pausing to catch my breath. My hair was thinning, coming away in my brush in clumps that looked like dead silk. But it was the itch that was the worst. It started at the base of my spine and spread like a wildfire under my skin. It wasn't an external itch, it was the feeling of my own flesh wanting to detach itself from the bone, a restless, crawling sensation that made me want to scream until my lungs burst. One night, after a particularly grueling session with a man whose breath smelled like an open grave, I caught David staring at me while I tried to eat a piece of dry toast. He wasn't looking at my face. He was staring at a small, dark spot that had appeared on the back of my neck, the first of the lesions. His eyes weren't filled with horror. They were filled with a terrifying, clinical fascination. "It's working," he whispered to himself, so low I barely caught it. "What's working, David?" I asked, my voice a ghost of what it once was. He jumped, his eyes snapping to mine. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes, which were darting toward the stairs. "Nothing, honey. Just the payments. We're almost clear. Just a few more. I promise. Just a few more, and we can go back to how things were." But as I sat there, feeling the hollow ache in my bones and hearing the inhuman voices whispering of the coming flaying, I knew he was lying. We were never going back. Sarah was being erased, inch by inch, to pay a debt that David had no intention of ever fully settling. I was no longer a wife. I was a vessel being drained, and the thing that sat across from me in the kitchen wasn't my husband, it was the man who was holding the straw. The transition from being a woman to becoming a specimen happened in the quiet, sterile hours of a Tuesday morning. I woke up not to the sound of birds or the soft hum of the neighborhood, but to the sensation of my nightgown being glued to my skin. It was a tacky, cold adhesion that sent a jolt of alarm through my sluggish nervous system. I sat up, and the fabric tore away from my back with a sickening, wet sound, like a bandage being ripped from a fresh wound. A sharp, electric sting flared across my shoulder blades, followed by a wave of nausea so potent I had to clutch the edge of the mattress to keep from falling. And then, I smelled it. It wasn't just the sulfur of the candles anymore. It was a heavy, coppery stench, a metallic tang of old blood mixed with the sweet, cloying scent of something that had been dead for a week in the summer heat. It was the smell of a rusted morgue. It was coming from me. I stumbled into the bathroom, my legs feeling like brittle glass. I fumbled with the light switch, and the harsh fluorescent glow felt like a physical assault. I turned, craning my neck to look into the vanity mirror, peeling the silk gown down to my waist. I screamed, but the sound was thin and papery, a dry rattle in my throat. Scatterings of black, circular lesions had bloomed across my back, concentrated along my spine. They looked like scorched earth, deep and obsidian dark, but they weren't dry. They were weeping a thick, translucent amber fluid that carried that horrific coppery odor. They looked like eyes, blind, staring eyes that had been burned into my flesh. The skin around them was puckered and gray, the veins standing out in stark, bruised violet. The bathroom door opened. David stood there, a cup of that dark, iron-tasting tonic in his hand. He didn't look shocked. He didn't drop the cup. He just stood there, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the tile. "David, look at me," I gasped, gesturing wildly at the mirror. "What is this?" "My skin it's dying. We have to go to the ER, now. I feel like I'm rotting." He walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. He set the cup on the sink and reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of one of the black sores. I flinched, expecting a spark of pain, but his touch was as cold as the men who came at night. "Sarah, breathe," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, as if he were explaining a bank statement. "You're overreacting. It's stress. Only stress." "Stress?" "David, look at the color. Look at the fluid. Stress doesn't turn your skin into charcoal." He turned me around, forcing me to look him in the eye. "It's a severe form of stress-induced eczema, Sarah. Or maybe an acute allergic reaction to the incense." I looked it up. The skin is a sensitive organ, it reacts to trauma. After everything we've been through, after the payments you've made, your body is just overwhelmed. It looks worse than it is because of the low light. It smells like death, David. I cried, the tears finally breaking through, hot and stinging against my pale, gray cheeks. It's the tonic, he countered immediately, his gaze steady, unblinking. The herbs in the medicine I'm giving you have a high sulfur and mineral content. It's coming out through your pores as your body detoxifies. It's actually a good sign. It means your system is purging the impurities. He grabbed a washcloth, soaked it in warm water, and began to dab at the weeping sores. He did it with a clinical detachment that made my blood run cold. He wasn't a husband comforting a sick wife, he was a curator tending to a fading tapestry. I'll get some high-grade antiseptic from the pharmacy, he continued, his voice a soothing, hypnotic drone. We don't need the ER. Imagine the questions they'd ask, Sarah. The police would get involved. They'd find out about the debt. They'd find out about the men. Do you want the loan sharks to come back? Do you want them to burn this house down with us inside? The mention of the men, the cold, marrow-sucking visitors, shut me down instantly. The fear of them was greater than the fear of my own dissolving flesh. He saw the shift in my eyes and nodded, a small, satisfied twitch at the corner of his mouth. Drink your tonic, he whispered, pressing the cold ceramic cup to my lips. I drank. I always drank. As the thick, bitter sludge slid down my throat, the whispers at the edge of the room flared into a deafening roar. They weren't just in the hallway anymore, they were inside the bathroom tiles, vibrating through the soles of my feet. The vessel pours, the beauty flows, the hollow fills where the spirit goes. Over the next few days, the gaslighting became my oxygen. Every time I felt a new sting on my thighs, every time I saw a patch of skin on my arms turn the color of a bruised plum, David had an answer. It was the soap. It was the lack of sunlight. It was my unstable mental state making me see things that weren't there. He began to cover the mirrors in the house with black cloth, claiming that seeing my dermatological flare-up was only increasing my cortisol levels and hindering my recovery. I lived in a world of shadows and fabric. I stopped wearing clothes that weren't loose and dark, because anything else would become sodden with the amber weeping of my back within hours. I didn't know then that I was a battery being drained. I didn't know that my vitality, that spark of life I had nurtured through a lonely childhood, was being siphoned off through the conduit of those black lesions. I felt it, though. I felt my hair losing its luster, my eyes becoming sunken and dull, my very features softening and blurring as if I were a wax figure left too close to a flame. David, on the other hand, was transforming. He was no longer the haggard, rain-drenched man who had collapsed on the foyer mat. He looked younger. His skin was vibrant, his eyes clear and piercing. He moved with a new, aggressive energy. He had started buying expensive clothes, Italian leather shoes, tailored suits, claiming he was projecting success to keep the creditors at bay. He would leave for hours at a time, coming back smelling of expensive cigars and a perfume that definitely wasn't mine. Who is she, David? I asked one night, my voice a thready, weak rasp. I was huddled on the sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket despite the humid heat of the house. He didn't even look up from his phone. Who is who, Sarah? You're getting paranoid again. The tonic has a sedative side effect. You should go to sleep. I smell perfume. Flowers. Not like the lilies in the room. Real flowers. He finally looked at me, and for a second, the mask slipped. His eyes weren't filled with the love I had sacrificed my body for. They were filled with the same flat, obsidian hunger I had seen in the men who visited the guest room. You smell the antiseptic I'm using on your back, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming hard and dangerously quiet. Don't start with the delusions, Sarah. I'm the only one standing between you and a shallow grave. I'm the only one who can stand to even be in the same room as that stench you're putting off. He hit me where it hurt the most. He used my own rotting body as a cage. If I was too disgusting for the world, I had to stay with him. I was a monster, and he was my only keeper. That night, as I lay in the darkness of the guest room, the bed now permanently stained with the dark ink of the sigils and the amber of my sores, the whispers became a single, clear voice. It wasn't the rasp of dry leaves. It was a woman's voice, melodic and cruel, echoing from somewhere deep within the floorboards. Thank you for the ivory, Sarah. Thank you for the glow. Your roses are blooming in my garden now. I reached back, my fingers trembling, and touched one of the lesions on my spine. It felt different. It didn't feel like skin anymore. It felt like wood. Hard, dead, and hollow. The itch had moved deeper, into the bone, a restless, scratching hunger that told me the veiled covenant was almost done with its work. My skin was no longer mine, it was a debt being collected, one weeping inch at a time. And as I drifted into a drug-induced stupor, I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that the coppery smell was no longer coming from the sores. It was coming from my breath. I was rotting from the heart outward. The disintegration was no longer a slow, creeping rot, it became a violent, wet unraveling. By the following Sunday, the skin on my thighs and abdomen had begun to blister into enormous, translucent bubbles filled with a foul, neon-yellow fluid that looked like bile. When they burst, and they always burst, the skin didn't just tear, it sloughed off in heavy, wet sheets, sliding down my body like sodden paper. Beneath was something no human should ever have to see while they are still drawing breath, raw, weeping muscle and white, glistening fascia, exposed to the cold, unforgiving air of a house that had become a tomb. The final guest arrived on a night when the moon was hidden behind a thick, suffocating blanket of fog. He was a small, twitchy man who smelled of mothballs and cheap peppermint. David led him into the room with the usual practice deference, but the moment the man stepped across the threshold, the illusion shattered. The smell of the room, my smell, hit him like a physical blow. It was no longer just coppery or sulfurous, it was the overwhelming, gagging stench of an open sewer mixed with a slaughterhouse. When he pulled back the heavy velvet curtains of the bed and saw me, my torso a map of red, raw meat and peeling gray parchment, he didn't just recoil. He stumbled back, his hands over his mouth, and vomited violently onto the hardwood floor, right over the dark, oily sigils. He fled the house without a word, his car tires screaming as he peeled out of the driveway. David didn't come to comfort me. He didn't come to clean up the mess. I heard his footsteps, heavy and rhythmic, pacing the hallway for an hour. When he finally entered the room, he was wearing a heavy-duty respirator mask, the kind used by industrial painters. His eyes, visible behind the plastic goggles, were no longer filled with the cold hunger of the ritual, they were filled with a sharp, jagged disgust. He looked at me as one looks at a bloated animal on the side of the highway. You're useless like this, he muffled through the mask. You're a liability. The smell is getting into the ductwork. The neighbors are starting to talk about the sewer leak coming from our yard. I can't keep you here. David, please, I wheezed. My vocal cords felt as though they were coated in grit. Help me. Call a doctor. Please. You don't get it, do you? He stepped closer, but only to grab a roll of heavy-duty black plastic sheeting from the corner of the room. There is no doctor for this. This is the transition. You're becoming what the covenant needs. But you can't do it here. He didn't wait for my consent. He never did anymore. He wrapped me in the plastic, the crinkling sound deafening in the quiet room. The sensation of the cold, non-breathable plastic against my raw, skinless back was a new kind of agony, a suffocating heat that made my nerves scream. He bundled me like a piece of hazardous waste and carried me down the back stairs in the dead of night. He threw me into the back of his Ford Explorer, the car we had taken to the Poconos for our anniversary, and drove. We drove for hours. The suburban streetlights gave way to the scattered orange glows of rural gas stations, and eventually, to the total, oppressive darkness of the deep Pennsylvania woods. The vibration of the car through the plastic sheeting felt like 1,000 tiny knives. I drifted in and out of a fever dream, the whispers in my head now a roaring tide of inhuman chanting. When the car finally stopped, the air was different. It was thin, sharp, and smelled of damp pine and old, wet earth. David hauled me out and dragged me across a carpet of dead leaves and snapping twigs. I saw the silhouette of the cabin, a derelict hunting shack that looked like it was being swallowed by the forest. The wood was black with rot, the windows were jagged teeth of broken glass, and the porch groaned under our weight like a dying animal. He dropped me onto a rusted iron cot in the center of the single room. The plastic sheeting fell away, and for the first time in weeks, the cold mountain air hit my raw flesh. I gasped, my body convulsing in a violent shiver that felt like it would snap my bones. "I'll bring you the tonic twice a week," David said, standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the pale, pre-dawn light. He didn't step further inside. Even with the mask, he couldn't stand to be near the creature he had made. "There's a well out back. If you can't walk, you'll have to crawl. The ritual needs you to be isolated now. The beauty is almost fully transferred. Lily is glowing, Sarah. She's magnificent." The name hit me harder than the cold. Lily. The woman from my visions. The woman who was wearing my ivory, my glow, my life. I tried to speak, to scream, to curse him, but all that came out was a wet, bubbling gurgle. "Don't look at me like that," David snapped, his voice echoing in the hollow cabin. "You agreed to this. You said you'd do anything for me. This is the anything, Sarah. This is the price." He turned and walked away. I heard his car start, the engine fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the rotting logs. The mental isolation didn't settle in all at once, it arrived in waves, like a rising tide. For the first few days, I lay on that rusted cot, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a rescue that I knew would never come. I watched the shadows of the trees move across the floorboards, tall and spindly like the men who had visited the guest room. I was alone with my rot, alone with the realization that my sacrifice hadn't been an act of love, but a transaction of which I was the currency. But I wasn't entirely alone. It started with a single, fat black fly. It landed on the raw meat of my forearm, its iridescent wings twitching with a frantic, buzzing energy. I didn't have the strength to brush it away. I watched as it lowered its proboscis into the yellow fluid weeping from my flesh. It tasted me. It liked me. Soon, there were 10. Then 50. Then a swarm so thick they looked like a moving, pulsing carpet of obsidian. They filled the cabin with a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated in my ears, harmonizing with the whispers of the covenant. They didn't just land, they feasted. I could feel their tiny, bristled legs dancing over my nerves, their frantic movements a mockery of the life I was losing. They became my only company, my only metric of time. I began to name them in my delirium. I began to talk to them. I told them about Sarah, the girl who had folded laundry and cooked pot roast. I told them about the craftsman house and the green lawn. They responded with a deafening buzz, their multifaceted eyes reflecting my own shattered, skinless face back at me 1,000 times over. This was the veiled covenant at its most brutal. It wasn't just taking my skin, it was taking my humanity, reducing me to a living buffet for the scavengers of the forest. My interest in narratives of sacrifice, which I once found so moving, felt like a cruel joke now. There was no nobility here. There was only the wet, sloshing sound of my own dissolution and the frantic, hungry hum of the flies. As the sun set on my 5th day in the cabin, I felt a new sensation, a deep, rhythmic thudding beneath the floorboards. It wasn't David. It was something else. The earth itself seemed to be breathing, pulsating in time with my raw, exposed heart. The forest was no longer just a place I was hidden in, it was a witness. And as the flies blanketed my body like a living, buzzing shroud, I realized that I wasn't just waiting to die. I was waiting for the skin to finally be gone, so that the thing beneath could truly wake up. The silence of the Pennsylvania woods is a lie. It is not quiet, it is a cacophony of my own dissolution. In this derelict shack, miles from a paved road or a human voice, the only thing louder than the frantic, rhythmic humming of the flies is the sound of my own skin leaving me. It happens in the deep, freezing hours of the night when the frost creeps through the cracks in the rotting logs. I hear it. Srip. Syrup. It is the sound of wet silk tearing, of a ripe peach being bruised until the rind gives way. When the pieces hit the floorboards, they don't just fall with a wet slap. They speak. It started on the 7th night. I was huddled on the iron cot, my body a map of exposed, pulsating nerves, when a long, jagged strip of skin from my left forearm finally detached and slid to the dust-covered wood. I expected the usual flare of agony, the cold bite of the air against my raw meat. Instead, I heard a sound that made my non-existent heart skip a beat. It was a soft, gurgling sob, followed by a voice that sounded like a distorted recording of my own. The diner in Pittsburgh, the piece of skin whispered. Its edges curled and twitched on the floor like a dying moth. The one with the neon sign that flickered eat into at. You wore the yellow dress. David told you your eyes looked like amber in that light. He promised he'd never let you go hungry again. A wave of warmth, a phantom sensation of that yellow dress against my hips, washed over me. I remembered the smell of the greasy burgers, the weight of David's hand over mine. It was a beautiful memory, one of the anchors that had held me to him for all these years. But as I watched the strip of skin on the floor shrivel and blacken under the cabin's stagnant dampness, the memory began to flicker. It grew dim, the colors fading to a grainy gray, until, with a final, wet gasp from the flesh, it simply vanished. I tried to reach for it, to pull the image of that night back into the center of my mind, but there was nothing there. Only a cold, hollow void where a piece of my history had been. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in my mouth. No, I wheezed, my throat feeling like it was lined with rusted wire. No, not that one. Give it back. But the floorboards didn't listen. Another piece, this one from my shoulder, where a black lesion had finally burned through, sloughed off. The first snow in the craftsman house, the skin wept, its translucent surface glistening with that putrid yellow bile. You made hot cocoa with the tiny marshmallows. David built a fire in the hearth. He called you his queen. He said he finally felt like he was home. I felt the phantom heat of that fireplace for a fleeting second, the taste of chocolate on my tongue. Then, just like before, as the skin withered, the memory was sucked out of me. It was as if a vacuum had been pressed against my soul, siphoning away every drop of joy I had ever known with the man who had discarded me here. I realized then, with a horror that made my raw muscles twitch in a rhythmic, agonizing spasm, what the veiled covenant truly was. David hadn't just sold my body, he had sold my past. This wasn't just a physical transition. Every strip of skin that sloughed off was a page of my life being ripped out and handed over. My ivory, my glow, my vitality, they were the fuel for the ritual, and my happy memories were the currency. Lily wasn't just wearing my skin. She was wearing my smiles. She was wearing the way I looked at him on our wedding day. She was inheriting the Sarah that David had pretended to love, while the real Sarah was being reduced to a nameless, historyless pile of screaming meat in a dark forest. I remember, the wedding, I whispered into the darkness, my voice a thready, desperate rasp. The white roses. The old church in the valley. A piece of skin from my cheek, the one that used to dimple when I laughed, chose that moment to fall. It landed near the rusted leg of the cot. I am the white roses, the skin hissed, its voice more jagged now, more inhuman. I am the vow. To have and to hold. He held you so he could crush you. He had you so he could sell you. I am leaving you now. I am going to her. I clutched my head, my fingers, now mostly bone and tendon, digging into my raw scalp. The memory of the wedding vanished. I could no longer see the altar. I could no longer hear the music. I knew the event had happened, but it felt like a story I had read about someone else, a hollow fact devoid of emotion or warmth. All that remained in its place was the memory of the pain. I remembered the cold men in the guest room. I remembered the stench of the tonics. I remembered the sound of David's car driving away from this cabin. The covenant was efficient. It left the trauma because the trauma was the anchor that kept me tethered to this world, kept me alive just enough to keep producing the sorry, the nectar of my suffering. It only took the beauty. It only took the love. By dawn, the floor of the cabin was littered with the discarded husks of my life. My first Christmas. The time we got lost in Philly and ended up dancing in a dive bar. The way he looked when he slept. All of it lay there, weeping and whispering until they finally went silent and turned to gray, stinking mush. I lay on the iron cot, my body a red, glistening ruin, my mind a bleak, dark landscape of scars and betrayals. I was being hollowed out, my humanity being peeled away inch by inch. I looked down at my hands, my skinless, claw-like hands, and felt a new, cold sensation rising from the marrow of my bones. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even fear anymore. The happy memories were gone, and without them, there was no Sarah left to be a victim. There was only the I that remained. The I that was made of raw muscle and black lesions. The I that was beginning to enjoy the hum of the flies. If the skin was the veil, and the veil was gone, then there was nothing left to hide the monster David had created. The voices on the floor had stopped weeping. Now, they were laughing, a wet, bubbling sound that harmonized perfectly with the thudding of the earth beneath the cabin. Take it all, I hissed at the floorboards, as a final piece from my chest, right over my heart, began to peel. Take every drop of love. Take every smile. Leave me with nothing but the rot. Leave me with nothing but the scream. I closed my eyes, or what was left of them, and waited for the final memory to fall. I wanted to be empty. I wanted to be a void. Because only a void could hold the amount of hate I felt for the man who was currently watching my roses bloom in another woman's garden. The 9th day arrived with a sudden, eerie stillness. The wind had died down, and even my swarm of flies had settled into a heavy, expectant silence, their thousands of wings tucked tight against their obsidian bodies. I lay on the floorboards, having long since slid off the iron cot, my raw musculature now fused to the rotting wood by the drying amber of my own viscera. I was more cabin than woman now, a living part of the architecture of decay. Then I heard it, the low, rhythmic hum of a luxury engine approaching. It wasn't the rattling Ford Explorer David usually drove to bring me my vitamins. This was the smooth, silent purr of something far more expensive. I dragged myself toward the wall, the sound of my exposed flesh peeling away from the wood, a series of wet, rhythmic pops that echoed in the hollow room. I pressed a bulging, lidless sphere of red and white, against a jagged crack in the logs. The light of the setting sun was a blinding, orange fire, casting long, skeletal shadows across the clearing. David stepped out of a sleek, silver Mercedes. He looked magnificent. The man who had once been a frazzled, middle-class accountant was gone. He stood taller, his shoulders broad and powerful, his skin possessing a translucent, pearlescent glow that seemed to catch the light and hold it. He moved with a terrifying, predatory elegance. But it was the woman who stepped out of the passenger side who stopped my breath. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with hair like spun silk and skin that looked like polished ivory. She was breathtaking, a masterpiece of human form. She looked exactly like the woman from my fever dreams. This was Lily. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice a tinkling chime that felt like a razor across my nerves. She gestured toward the cabin, her nose wrinkling in a delicate, rehearsed display of distaste. "The smell, David, it's unbearable." "It's almost over, my love," David said, his voice a rich, honeyed baritone I no longer recognized. He reached out and stroked her cheek with a tenderness he had once reserved for me. "The transition is in its final phase. The sorry is at its most potent when the vessel is at its most hollow." He pulled a small, silver-capped vial from his pocket. I recognized the contents instantly. It was the neon yellow fluid, the putrid bile that had been leaking from my blisters for weeks. He had been harvesting me while I slept in my drug-induced stupors back at the house. I watched, frozen in a state of paralyzing, metaphysical horror, as David unscrewed the cap. A wave of that sickening, coppery stench drifted toward me even through the crack in the logs. He dipped his fingers into the fluid, my fluid, and began to apply it to Lily's face. He moved in precise, ritualistic patterns, tracing the very same sigils he had carved into our bedroom floor. As the amber slime touched her skin, it didn't burn her. It didn't blister her. It was absorbed instantly, leaving behind a radiance that was so bright it was almost painful to look at. Her skin grew tighter, more luminous, her eyes sparkling with an unnatural, vibrant green light. "I feel it," Lily whispered, her head lolling back in a trance-like ecstasy. "I feel her, her youth, her memories. I can see the yellow dress, David. I can see the roses." "It's all yours now," David murmured, leaning in to kiss her neck. "Every drop of it. You'll never age, Lily. You'll never wither. We have all the time in the world." "But the debt?" she asked, her eyes fluttering open. "The men? The creditors you told her about?" David let out a sharp, cruel bark of a laugh that shattered the last remains of my shattered heart. "There was no debt, Lily. I don't gamble with money. I only gamble with souls. I needed a vessel that was pure, someone whose devotion was so absolute she wouldn't question the rot until it was too late. Sarah was perfect. She loved me so much she literally let me peel her apart." He looked toward the cabin then, his eyes finding the very crack I was peeking through. For a second, I thought he could see me, the red, weeping monster that used to be his wife. But he looked right through me, as if I were nothing more than the wood and the dust. "She's just a husk now," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any humanity. "A battery that's almost drained. Once the last memory falls, the earth will take the rest. We'll burn this shack to the ground next week and leave the ashes for the flies. We're moving to the coast, Lily. To a house with a view of the sea." They got back into the car, the silver Mercedes disappearing into the growing shadows of the pines as silently as it had arrived. I fell back onto the floorboards, a dry, rattling sob shaking my frame. The truth didn't just break me, it annihilated the Sarah that had been clinging to life. There were no lone sharks. There were no dangerous men. There was only a man who had seen my love as a resource to be mined, and a mistress who was currently wearing my history like a stolen coat. Every act of service, every night of cold, marrow-siphoning agony, every weeping lesion, it had all been a performance for an audience of two. I had been a voluntary sacrifice to their narcissism. The whispers in the room changed then. They were no longer at the edge of my hearing, they were screaming from the very marrow of my bones. They weren't speaking of a harvest anymore. They were speaking of a reckoning. "The debt is not paid," the voices hissed, harmonizing with the sudden, violent buzzing of my flies. "The skin is not hers. The roses are thorns." I looked down at my hands. They were no longer just raw meat. The black, oily substance from the sigils was beginning to leak from my own veins, mixing with the red and the yellow. My muscles felt stronger, fueled by a cold, obsidian rage that was far more potent than the life I had lost. I realized the user had been right to note my fascination with narratives of sacrifice and dramatic plot twists. But this was a twist I hadn't seen coming. My husband hadn't just betrayed me, he had tried to erase me. He wanted me to be an unmarked grave, a forgotten footnote in his eternal life. "No," I hissed, the sound echoing like a death rattle in the tiny cabin. "I am not the husk. I am the rot. And the rot always finds its way home." I felt the last happy memory, the way he used to call my name in the morning, shrivel and die on the floorboards. I was empty now. A perfect void. And into that void, the dark spirit of the woods began to pour. I didn't need skin to be a monster. I just needed a purpose. I would let them have their week. I would let them pack their bags for the coast. I would let Lily enjoy my glow for a few more days. Because when the veiled covenant was truly finished, they would realize that the beauty they had stolen was just a mask for the horror they had invited in. I am Sarah. I am the sacrifice. And I am coming for my skin. The air in the cabin had become a physical weight, a thick, gelatinous fog of humidity and decomposition that clung to the exposed rafters like a shroud. I was no longer a person, I was a living wound, a biological error twitching on the edge of a rusted iron cot. Every breath felt like inhaling a cloud of ground glass, my lungs struggling against the thickening sludge of my own fluids. My skin was gone, every inch of the ivory silk David used to praise was now nothing but a memory, or worse, a layer of radiance on Lily's stolen face. I was just raw, red meat, a glistening map of muscles and nerves that shrieked at the slightest touch of the mountain air. Then, the door creaked open. It was a sharp, dry sound that pierced through the constant, maddening hum of my flies. David stepped in. He wasn't wearing the respirator anymore. He didn't need to. The ritual was so close to completion that the stench of my death seemed to pass through him, as if he were already existing on a higher plane of being. He looked at me with a detached curiosity, the way a scientist might observe a culture in a petri dish that had finally outlived its usefulness. He was dressed in a crisp, white linen shirt that seemed to glow in the dim, gray light of the cabin, a stark, insulting contrast to the filth I was drowning in. "It's almost over, Sarah," he said. His voice was melodic, devoid of the frantic edge that had defined him for years. "The last thread is fraying. I can feel it. Lily can feel it. You've done so well. You really were the perfect vessel." A final, desperate spark of the woman I used to be flared up in the center of my agony. I didn't want to die like this, not as a nameless husk, not as a forgotten transaction. I needed him to see me. I needed him to acknowledge the soul he had flayed. I rolled off the cot. The sound of my raw flesh hitting the grimy floorboards was a wet, heavy thud that sent a shockwave of white-hot pain through my entire being. I didn't care. I dragged myself forward, my finger bones scratching at the wood, leaving a trail of dark, viscous fluid behind me. Every inch was a mile of torture. I could feel the grit of the cabin floor, the dust and the dead flies, embedding themselves into my exposed muscles. I reached for him. My hand, a skeletal claw of red tendons and gray bone, scraped across the floor until I found the polished leather of his boot. I gripped it with a strength I didn't know I had left, my vision blurring into a haze of blood and tears. "David." I wheezed, the word rattling in my chest. "Please. Just say you loved me. Just once. Before the end." I wasn't asking for life. I wasn't even asking for a doctor anymore. I was begging for a lie to hold on to while I crossed over. I was begging for a shred of the mercy he had promised me when he had put that ring on my finger. David looked down at my hand. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He didn't look at me with pity, he looked at me like I was a stain he had forgotten to scrub out. "Get off me," he hissed. He didn't just pull away. He drew back his foot and kicked me. The blow caught me square in the chest, right where my skinless ribs were most vulnerable. I heard the sickening crack of bone, felt the air leave my body in a wet, bubbling gasp. I was sent sliding across the floorboards, my body leaving a smear of red across the filth of my prison. I collapsed against the wall, my head lolling to the side. Through the haze, I saw him taking out a silk handkerchief and fastidiously wiping the blood from the toe of his boot. "You're pathetic, Sarah," he said, and for the first time, there was a flicker of genuine emotion in his voice, boredom. "You talk about love as if it were something more than a tool. I used your love to buy 1,000 years. Why would I mourn the tool that did exactly what it was designed to do?" He turned his back on me and walked toward the door. "I won't be back for the next tonic. There's no point. The sorry is harvested. The covenant is sealed. Enjoy your rest, Sarah. You've earned it." The door slammed shut, and the heavy iron bolt slid into place from the outside. I was alone. Truly, finally alone. The flies, sensing the change, descended in a frantic, black cloud, their thousands of tiny legs dancing over my eyes, my mouth, my open wounds. I tried to lift my hand to brush them away, but the nerves had finally given up. My body was a leaden weight, a cooling lump of meat that was no longer mine. The stench was unimaginable now, the smell of my own mortality, thick and cloying, filling every corner of the shack. I looked toward the cracks in the logs, seeing the deep, indifferent green of the Pennsylvania woods. No one was coming. No one would ever know I died here. There would be no funeral, no obituary, no flowers. I would be a missing person report that would eventually grow cold and be filed away in a dusty drawer. I was dying unmourned, a ghost before my heart had even stopped. I took a breath, and it was the last. It was a shallow, rattling thing that tasted of copper and forest rot. My heart gave one final, sluggish thud and then went silent. The void didn't take me instantly. For a few moments, I hovered in the gray space between, watching my own ruin. I saw the flies claim their prize. I saw the way the cabin seemed to sigh as it absorbed the last of my warmth. I felt the weight of being forgotten. In that silence, in the cold realization that I was a waste to be buried, something snapped. The grief that had sustained me, the love that had blinded me, it all burned away in the freezing vacuum of death. What was left wasn't Sarah. What was left was the vacancy where Sarah used to be, and it was filled with a cold, obsidian darkness that was older than the woods themselves. I was dead. But as the dark rot of the covenant began to seep into my cooling marrow, I realized that death was just another veil. And I was done with veils. The cold didn't leave when my breath did. It settled into my marrow, a heavy, crystalline weight that anchored my consciousness to a body that had become an insult to nature. Being dead was not the silent void I had expected, it was a heightened state of awareness, a terrifying intimacy with my own decomposition. I felt the flies slowing down as my flesh cooled, their buzzing turning into a mournful drone. I felt the cabin air grow stagnant, the wood groaning as if in relief that the vessel of so much suffering had finally broken. David returned 3 hours later. I knew it was him before the door even opened, the smooth hum of the Mercedes cutting through the forest's ancient rhythm. He entered the room with a shovel in one hand and a roll of heavy-duty duct tape in the other. He didn't look at my face. He didn't check for a pulse. He didn't need to. He could smell the finality of it. He began to work with a brutal, efficient speed that mirrored the dark narratives of sacrifice I had always been drawn to. He didn't clean me. He didn't wash away the yellow bile or the crusted blood that had become my only raiment. He simply reached for the bedsheets, the same cheap, floral print linens we had bought on sale at a Target 3 years ago, and began to wrap me. He bundled my raw, red limbs tight against my torso, the fabric sticking to my exposed muscle with a sickening, wet adhesion. When the sheets ran out, he used a dirty blue tarp he'd found in the corner of the shack. He bound the whole mess together with duct tape, mummifying me in a cocoon of filth and plastic. I felt every jerk of his arms, every pull of the tape. I was no longer Sarah to him, I was a problem to be solved, a piece of hazardous waste to be tucked away. He hauled my bundled form off the cot, my head hitting the floorboards with a dull thud that would have shattered my skull if I were still alive. He dragged me out the back door, the rough wood of the porch scraping against my makeshift shroud. The grave was shallow, dug in haste behind the cabin where the roots of a dying oak twisted through the dirt like arthritic fingers. He rolled me in. I hit the bottom of the pit, my face pressed against the cold, damp Pennsylvania clay. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered. There was no grief in his voice, only the flat, terrifyingly clear satisfaction of a man who had finally balanced a difficult ledger. The first shovelful of dirt hit my head. Then another. And another. The weight of the earth began to press down on me, crushing the last of the air from my collapsed lungs. He stamped the ground flat with his expensive boots, the thuds vibrating through the soil and into my cooling bones. I heard his car start. I heard the tires kick up gravel as he sped away toward his new life, his new house, and the woman who was currently wearing the glow he had flayed from me. In the absolute darkness of the earth, I waited for the end. I waited for the blackness to finally take my mind, to erase the memory of David's kick and the sound of his laughter. But the end didn't come. Instead, the darkness began to change. It started with the vengeance. It wasn't a hot, red anger, it was a cold, obsidian fire that ignited in the center of my chest. It was the same dark energy that fueled the dramatic plot twists I once enjoyed, the moment where the victim realizes they are the monster. The veiled covenant had taken my skin, my beauty, and my memories, but it had left behind the one thing it couldn't consume, my hate. And that hate was now interacting with the ritualistic filth David had left inside me. The earth began to reject me. I felt the soil around me start to churn, not from a physical force, but from a metaphysical repulsion. The very worms that had approached to feast on my flesh recoiled, dying instantly as they touched my shroud. The roots of the oak tree shriveled and pulled away, as if my presence were a poison the forest could not stomach. Then, the ground began to shake. A low-frequency vibration started deep within the bedrock, a rhythmic, thudding pulse that matched the heart I no longer possessed. It grew louder, a subterranean roar that cracked the surface of the grave. I moved. My muscles, stripped of their skin but reinforced by the black bile of the ritual, surged with an unnatural strength. I pushed upward. The duct tape snapped with the sound of gunfire. The tarps and floral bedsheets, now soaked through with a cocktail of pus, blood, and forest rot, became my new skin, a heavy, wet armor of burial linens. My hand, a skeletal claw wrapped in tattered, muddy fabric, broke through the surface of the Pennsylvania soil. I dragged myself out of the earth, a vertical birth from a grave that couldn't hold me. I stood on the mound of my own burial, my form a terrifying silhouette against the pale, indifferent moonlight. I was no longer a woman. I was a revenant, a Pocahontas of the American woods, my head and feet tied tight by the remnants of the linens David had used to discard me. I hopped, a jagged, spasmodic movement, my shroud trailing a scent of ancient earth and fresh rot. I looked at the cabin. It looked small, pathetic. The ritual was complete, but the outcome had shifted. David had wanted to create an unmarked grave, instead, he had built a monument to his own destruction. I felt the link then. It was a silver thread of energy stretching through the trees, vibrating with the rhythm of my stolen memories. It led away from the forest, toward the suburbs, toward the house where David and Lily were currently celebrating their eternal youth. They were the ones who had initiated this narrative of familial conflict and sacrifice, and now I was the one who would write the ending. The sheets around my face were tight, soaked with the fluids of my transition, but I didn't need to see with eyes. I saw with the hunger of the rot. I saw with the pain of every flayed inch of my soul. I hopped toward the silver Mercedes tracks. Every time my bound feet hit the ground, the forest went silent. The crickets stopped. The owls fled. The world knew that I who had risen was not the Sarah who had been buried. Sarah was dead, her devotion paid in full. The thing that remained was the debt collector. I would find him. I would find them both. I would not walk, I would not run, I would haunt the periphery of their vision until the smell of my burial linens was the only thing they could taste. The earth had rejected me, and now, I would make the world reject them. The silver thread of my stolen memories didn't just lead me back to civilization, it acted as a leash, pulling my bound, rotting form through the dark underbrush of the Pennsylvania wilds and toward the manicured lawns of the life I once owned. I moved with a rhythmic, sickening thud, a jagged series of hops that left a trail of dark, viscous fluid on the asphalt of the quiet suburban streets. I was a nightmare wrapped in the floral target sheets of a forgotten marriage, a physical manifestation of the familial conflict David thought he had buried in a shallow pit. As I reached the edge of our driveway, the house looked exactly as I remembered it, yet fundamentally altered, as if a filter of cold, expensive vanity had been placed over the windows. Inside, the air was pressurized with a victory that smelled of ozone and expensive perfume. I stood in the shadows of the oak tree where I used to garden, watching through the French doors of the dining room. David was there, looking vibrant and unnaturally young, his skin glowing with the ivory sari he had harvested from my suffering. He was pouring a vintage champagne into crystal flutes, his movements fluid and confident. Lily sat across from him, draped in a silk robe that looked like liquid gold. She was beautiful, yes, but it was a stolen beauty, a mask made of my flayed youth and my erased smiles. To us, David toasted, his voice a smooth baritone that used to make me feel safe. To the coast. To never looking back. They drank, but the celebration lasted only as long as it took for the first tendril of my presence to seep through the vents. It didn't start as a sight, it started as a reek. It was the smell of a forgotten basement, of wet earth and rancid fat, a putrid scent of decay that no designer candle could mask. I watched as David's smile faltered. He sniffed the air, his brow furrowing. "Did you leave the trash out, Lily?" he asked, his voice losing a fraction of its polish. "No," she whispered, her hand trembling as she set down her glass. It smells like the cabin, David. It smells like her." The reek began to colonize the room. It clung to the sub-zero appliances, it settled into the fibers of the expensive rugs. As they tried to eat their celebratory dinner, a pair of Wagyu steaks that had cost more than my first car, the meat turned gray and weeping under their forks. The smell of my burial linens was now the only flavor they could taste. Every bite was an intake of forest rot and burial filth. David threw his silk napkin onto the table, his face contorting in a mask of the same revulsion he had shown me before he kicked me away in the dirt. But the smell was only the herald. The true payment began in the marrow. Lily stood up, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "David, it's so hot in here. My skin, it feels tight." I watched through the glass as she began to scratch. At first, it was a delicate, unconscious movement, a fingernail tracing the line of her collarbone. But within minutes, it became a frantic, desperate clawing. I could feel it through the silver thread connecting us, I could feel the phantom itch that wasn't on the surface, but deep beneath her stolen pores. It felt like the thousands of flies that had feasted on my raw meat were now hatching inside her, their tiny, bristled legs dancing over her nerves. "Stop it, you'll mark yourself," David hissed, grabbing her wrists. "I can't," she screamed, her voice cracking. "They're under there, David. I can feel them crawling. Thousands of them. They're eating me from the inside." As she struggled in his grip, I saw the first sign of the dramatic plot twist David hadn't accounted for. A small, dark spot appeared on her cheek, a black, weeping lesion exactly like the ones that had signaled my own destruction. The veiled covenant was a closed loop, the beauty was alone, and the interest was the very rod it was meant to replace. I leaned my head against the glass, the damp burial cloth sticking to the window pane, leaving a smear of red and yellow. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to know that the reek wasn't just in the vents, it was in the foundation of their new life. Lily looked toward the window then, her eyes wide with a primal, metaphysical terror as she saw the silhouette of the linen-wrapped monster standing in the dark. "David." She wheezed, her fingers finally breaking the skin of her arm, drawing a thick, yellow fluid instead of blood. "She's here. She never left. I didn't move. I didn't need to." The reek of my guilt was now their only reality. Every time they touched, they would feel the wetness of my grave. Every time they looked in the mirror, they would see the flies. The sacrifice had been made, but the altar was now coming to collect the priest. The night has no stars. For me, the sky is merely the lid of a vast, open coffin, and the wind is the collective wheeze of those who are dead but forced to remain awake. I move through the thick Pennsylvania fog, not with feet that touch the earth, but pulled by the jagged silver thread of a debt that can no longer be ignored. David told me I was serving these men to pay his debts. But in this realm, where lies have no tongue, I see the truth. They were not creditors, they were thieves of vitality, siphoning my marrow to extend their own wretched, hollow lives. Now, the interest is due. And I have come to collect it in the only currency they understand, every inch of the skin they used to mock. My first stop is a high-rise penthouse in Philadelphia, overlooking a city that sleeps in ignorant bliss. Inside, Mr. Miller, the slender man with the obsidian eyes who was my first visitor, lies in his silk sheets. He thinks his wealth and his expensive security system can keep out the consequences of the veiled covenant. He does not know that burial linens can slide through the cracks of a soul's darkest secrets. Sret, sret, sret. The sound is soft, yet it fills the room like the grinding of tectonic plates. It is the sound of my burial cloths, wet with pus, blood, and the stagnant water of the forest, dragging across his imported Persian rug. Mr. Miller sits up, clutching his designer duvet. He fumbles for the lamp, but the light that flickers on is a sickly, bruised violet, the color of my dying veins. He sees nothing in the corner but a smudge of darkness, yet he hears the sound that will be the last thing his mind ever processes. Thump, thud, thump, thud. It is a heartbeat. Heavy, slow, and echoing as if it were beating inside a hollowed-out log. It is not his heart. It is the sound of my heart, the one that stopped in the squalor of the cabin, beating in the air around him. Every thud sends a wave of sub-zero cold through the room, freezing the very air in his lungs. "Who's there?" he gasps, his voice a pathetic rattle. I do not show him my face. I do not want to shock him with the red, weeping muscle of my skull. I want him to experience the terror of the unseen, the same way I lay in the darkness of the guest room, waiting for him to touch me. The horror begins at his fingertips. He looks down as his skin begins to bubble and hiss. Without a blade, without a flame, the ivory surface of his hand starts to slough off in wet, translucent sheets, exactly as mine did in the cabin. He screams, but the sound is swallowed by the thumping of my dead heart. He tries to grab his phone, but the skin of his palm slides right off the bone, leaving behind a slick, red mess that cannot grip anything. I stand in the shadows, my linen-wrapped form vibrating with the frequency of his agony. I can feel it, the sorry he stole is flowing back toward the silver thread, but it is no longer beauty. It is rot. The debt is not paid, Mr. Miller, I whisper, the sound vibrating from the floorboards. You took my ivory. Now, give me your shroud. I leave him there, alive and conscious, as his skin continues to unravel from his body like a cheap suit. He will be found in the morning, a red, glistening anatomical model in a bed of silk, surrounded by a smell of forest rot that will never leave the room. The hunt continues. I move through the suburbs, through the gated communities where the investors of David's ritual hide. I visit the twitchy man who vomited at the sight of me. I find him in his basement, surrounded by bottles of peppermint and mothballs, trying to drown out the scent of the grave. He hears the dragging of my linens on the stairs. He hears the thudding of my heart in the ductwork. When his skin finally begins to peel, he doesn't scream, he laughs, a broken, hysterical sound as he watches his own reflection dissolve into a map of raw meat.